Have you ever noticed how your mind keeps replaying a moment? Not because it mattered to you, but because someone else might have noticed it. Strange thing is, you don't actually care about most people, yet somehow their invisible opinions seem to control how you feel. And the unsettling part isn't that they're judging you, it's that you've quietly built a version of yourself that depends on it. In this, we're not just looking at why you think about them, but why your mind refuses to stop. It usually doesn't begin with something obvious, not a dramatic moment, not a clear turning point. It starts in small, forgettable fragments, a glance that lasted a second too long, a pause in someone's voice, a message that felt slightly colder than usual. Nothing concrete, nothing you could prove. And yet your mind takes it, holds onto it, and begins to build something around it. You don't even notice when it happens. The shift is subtle. You go from experiencing a moment to analyzing it from the outside, as if you quietly step out of yourself and start watching your own behavior through someone else's eyes. Not fully, not consciously, just enough to create a distance. And that distance is where the thinking begins. At first it feels harmless, almost useful. You tell yourself you're just being aware, just reading situations, just trying to understand people better. But what most people don't realize is, the mind isn't trying to understand others here. It's trying to protect something much more fragile. Because the moment you start asking, what did they think of me? You've already accepted something without noticing. You've accepted that their perception has weight, not equal weight, not balanced, but just enough to tilt your sense of yourself. And that's where it starts to change. You begin adjusting in ways that don't feel like adjustments, slight changes in how you speak, the way you phrase something, the timing of your responses. You're not trying to impress anyone, but you're also not fully being yourself anymore. You're editing in real time, quietly, efficiently, almost invisibly. But that's not the real reason your mind won't stop, because if it were just about adjusting behavior, it would end when the moment ends. But it doesn't. It follows you home. It replays when you're alone. It resurfaces when you're doing something completely unrelated. And suddenly, you're back there, rethinking what you said, how you looked, whether you sounded strange, whether they noticed something you didn't. And here's the part people rarely admit. You're not actually trying to understand them. You're trying to find out if you're acceptable, not fully, not consciously, but just enough to keep checking. Because somewhere along the way, your mind learned something very specific. That how you are isn't something stable. It's something that needs to be confirmed over and over again, in different situations, with different people. And that's why one opinion never feels like enough. Even if someone reacts positively, it doesn't settle anything. Because your mind isn't looking for approval. It's looking for consistency. Something predictable. Something stable. Something that tells you, this is who you are. And it doesn't change depending on who's watching. But it never finds that. So it keeps going. It scans for reactions. It replays interactions. It searches for hidden meanings that may not even exist. And over time, something strange begins to happen. You stop experiencing people directly and start experiencing your interpretation of how they might see you. And that's a completely different reality. Because now you're no longer reacting to what's actually happening. You're reacting to a version of events filtered through uncertainty, through assumption, through a constant low-level doubt that never fully goes away. And that's where it starts to feel exhausting, but also strangely impossible to stop. because stopping would mean letting go of something your mind believes is important, not logically important, but emotionally necessary. The belief that if you just think about it enough, you'll finally understand how you're seen. But that clarity never arrives. Instead, the thinking becomes more detailed, more layered, more obsessive in a quiet, almost controlled way. You're not panicking, you're not overwhelmed, you're just constantly running background analysis. And here's where it becomes even more subtle. You don't question the thinking itself, you question yourself. You assume the problem is something you said, something you did, something you missed. So you go deeper into it. You analyze more carefully. You try to be more precise next time, more aware, more controlled. But what most people don't realize is this isn't awareness. It's dependence disguised as awareness, because real awareness lets you observe and move on. This keeps you there. And the longer you stay there, the more natural it feels. The more it becomes part of how you experience everything. Conversations are no longer just conversations, they're evaluations. Every silence means something. Every reaction becomes a clue. And slowly, without realizing it, you stop being the person in the moment. You become the person watching yourself in the moment. And that shift changes everything. Because once you start living from that position, you can't fully relax into anything. Not conversations, not relationships, not even your own thoughts. There's always a part of you slightly outside, slightly detached, slightly analyzing. And that's why it doesn't stop. Not because you're overthinking, but because you've learned to exist in two places at once. The version of you that lives, and the version of you that monitors. And the uncomfortable truth is, the second one feels safer, because as long as you're watching yourself, you feel like you can prevent something, control something, adjust something before it goes wrong. But that safety comes at a cost, because the more you monitor, the less you actually live. And here's where it becomes even more complicated. You might think this started because of people, because of how they reacted, because of something that made you more aware of yourself. But that's not the real origin, because there are people who go through the same situations and don't carry this constant thinking with them. So the question isn't just, why do you think about what people think? The deeper question is, why does your mind believe it needs to? And that's where the surface explanation begins to break. Because what looks like social awareness, what feels like emotional sensitivity, is often something much more controlled, much more calculated, much more tied to something you don't usually look at directly. And once you start seeing that, the entire pattern begins to look different, not louder, not clearer, just more precise. And that's where it starts to get uncomfortable, because the next layer isn't about what people think of you. It's about why their thoughts became something you quietly rely on. If you follow that pattern a little further, something begins to shift in a way that feels less comfortable and harder to ignore, because it slowly becomes clear that this isn't really about people in the way it appears on the surface. It's about something quieter, something that doesn't announce itself clearly, something that feels too ordinary to question directly. It's the way you learned to measure yourself, not through obvious rules or explicit expectations, but through small, repeated experiences where being noticed was never completely neutral. Attention had a tone to it, approval had a certain weight, and even silence carried a meaning that you couldn't fully explain but still absorbed. What most people don't realize is that the mind doesn't store these moments as clear memories that you can revisit and analyze logically. It stores impressions instead, subtle emotional conclusions that form beneath awareness and stay there without needing to be recalled. So you don't walk around remembering specific situations that shaped you. You walk around carrying the result of them, a quiet, internal structure that influences how you interpret every interaction without asking for your permission. And sometimes that structure includes a subtle assumption that who you are is not entirely stable, that it's something that shifts depending on how it's received rather than something that exists independently. Once that idea settles in, even in a small and almost invisible way, everything begins to change. Being yourself is no longer just a natural state you return to without effort. It becomes something that needs to be checked, something that needs to be adjusted, something that feels incomplete until it is reflected back to you in a way that confirms it. But the process doesn't feel forced or artificial. It feels automatic, almost like a background system running quietly, constantly scanning for signals that might tell you where you stand. The difficulty is that this doesn't happen at the level of conscious thought. You're not actively deciding that other people's opinions define you. In fact, you may strongly believe the opposite and feel confident in your independence. But this mechanism doesn't operate in your beliefs. It operates in your reactions, in the way your attention moves towards certain details without being directed, in the way your mind replays interactions long after they've ended, not because they were important in a practical sense, but because they felt unresolved in a subtle, almost unnoticeable way. This is where the perspective begins to shift. The reason you keep thinking about what people might think is not necessarily because their opinions carry objective importance. It's because your mind has been trained to treat those opinions as reference points, not final judgments, but small pieces of information that help you orient yourself. On the surface, this looks like awareness, like social intelligence, like the ability to read people carefully. But what most people don't recognize is that this process goes beyond adaptation. It doesn't end when the interaction ends. It continues because it is trying to stabilize something that doesn't feel stable on its own. You are not just thinking about them, you are using them to locate yourself. You are trying to determine where you stand, not in a social hierarchy, but within your own sense of identity. And that process is much more complex than it seems, because identity is not only about how you see yourself, but about how certain that perception feels. When that certainty is even slightly unstable, the mind begins to look outward for alignment, for something that can confirm consistency, something that feels reliable enough to hold on to. The problem is that other people cannot provide that consistency. Their perceptions are not fixed. They change based on context, mood, attention, and countless factors that have nothing to do with you. So even if someone sees you in a certain way at one moment, that perception cannot be trusted to remain the same. And although you may not consciously think about this, your mind recognizes it at a deeper level. That is why one interaction is never enough. That is why the thinking continues, updating, recalibrating, searching for a stable pattern in something that is inherently unstable. This is where the exhaustion begins to make sense. It is not the result of thinking too much in a general sense. It is the result of trying to solve a problem that does not have a fixed answer. You are attempting to define something about yourself using information that constantly changes, and no amount of analysis can create stability from something that is fundamentally fluid. Yet the mind continues, because stopping feels like losing a form of control, even if that control is only perceived. Underneath all of this, there is a quieter fear that is rarely acknowledged directly. It is not simply the fear of being judged. It is the fear of not knowing how to adjust without constant feedback. It is the fear that if you stop monitoring how you are perceived, you might miss something subtle but important, something that could have been corrected if you had only paid more attention. And that belief keeps the process active, even when it becomes tiring, even when it no longer feels useful. What begins to emerge from this is a deeper layer that is not immediately visible. When you remove the surface elements, other people, their reactions, the specific situations, you are left with something internal that continues to operate regardless of context. It does not depend on others to exist, but it uses others to stay active. And that is where this pattern stops being about social awareness and starts becoming something more personal, something that shapes your experience from underneath without presenting itself clearly. This is where the tension really exists, not in what people think of you, but in why that question never feels complete. Because no matter how much you analyze, no matter how carefully you observe, the answer always feels slightly out of reach. And that is not because you are missing something, it is because the question itself is not designed to be resolved in the way you are trying to resolve it. And once that becomes visible, even in a small way, the entire pattern begins to feel different. Not clearer, not easier, but more precise in a way that makes it harder to ignore. Because the next layer is no longer about what people think of you. It is about why their thoughts became something your mind continues to return to, even when you don't want it to. That is where the surface explanation begins to break completely, and where the deeper conflict starts to show itself, not as something dramatic, but as something constant, something that has been there for much longer than you initially realized. And once you begin to see that, the question is no longer about stopping the thinking. It becomes something else entirely, something that shifts the focus inward in a way that is difficult to avoid. And that is exactly where the problem begins to reveal itself in its full form. If this content speaks the words you can't explain, click subscribe. Thank you for your support. When you begin to look at it from that angle, something starts to feel slightly off in a way that's difficult to ignore, because the question is no longer, why do I keep thinking about what they think? It becomes, why does my mind keep returning to something that never gives a final answer? And that shift matters more than it seems, because it exposes a tension that isn't visible when you stay focused on other people. The real conflict doesn't sit in their opinions. It sits in the space between who you are when you're alone and who you become when you feel observed. Not in a dramatic way, not as a completely different person, but in subtle shifts that are easy to justify and almost impossible to notice in real time. A slight change in tone, a careful adjustment in wording, a small hesitation before you respond. Nothing that stands out, nothing that feels forced, but enough to create a difference. And that difference is where the problem begins. Because once there is a gap between those two versions of you, even a small one, the mind starts trying to manage it. It starts tracking which version works better, which one feels safer, which one receives less resistance. And over time, without any conscious decision, one version becomes more dominant in certain situations. Not because it's more authentic, but because it feels more controlled. But that's not the real issue. The real issue is that once you begin operating from a controlled version of yourself, you lose something that can't easily be replaced. Not confidence, not expression, not even comfort. You lose the sense that you exist independently of how you're being perceived. And that loss doesn't feel like a loss. It feels like awareness. It feels like maturity. It feels like understanding how to navigate people more effectively. But what most people don't realize is that this kind of awareness comes with a hidden cost. Because the more you rely on that external reference, the less stable your internal reference becomes. You begin to feel less certain about who you are without input, without feedback, without some form of reflection coming from outside. And that uncertainty doesn't show up as confusion. It shows up as constant checking. You replay conversations not because they were important, but because they didn't feel complete. You analyze reactions not because they were clear, but because they felt slightly ambiguous. And that ambiguity becomes difficult to tolerate, not because it matters objectively, but because it leaves something unresolved inside you. And that's where it starts to hurt in a way that's hard to explain, not sharply, not suddenly, but in a quiet, persistent way that builds over time. Because you begin to realize that no matter how much you think, no matter how carefully you analyze, you never arrive at a point where you can say, "This is enough. I understand how I'm seen." That point never comes. But the mind doesn't accept that. It keeps searching, keeps refining, keeps trying to close a gap that isn't meant to be closed. And the more it tries, the more detailed the thinking becomes. Not chaotic, not overwhelming, but precise, controlled, almost disciplined in the way it dissects every interaction. And that precision creates an illusion. It makes it feel like you're getting closer to something real, something accurate, something that will finally settle the uncertainty. But that's not what's happening. What's actually happening is that you're becoming more dependent on the process itself. The thinking becomes the mechanism that maintains a sense of control, even if it never produces a final answer. And here's where the conflict deepens, because part of you starts to recognize that this isn't working, that the thinking isn't resolving anything, that it's only extending itself. But another part of you doesn't want to stop, because stopping feels like stepping into something undefined, something that doesn't have structure, something that can't be monitored. And that creates a split. Not a dramatic one, not something that disrupts your behavior externally, but an internal division between the part of you that wants to let go and the part of you that feels safer holding on. And the longer that split exists, the more natural it feels, the more it becomes part of how you operate. You start living in a kind of quiet duality. One part of you is experiencing the moment. The other part is observing, evaluating, adjusting. And instead of those two parts working together, they begin to interfere with each other. The observer becomes dominant. The experiencer becomes secondary. And that's where something important begins to fade. Because when you're constantly observing yourself, you're never fully inside the moment. You're always slightly outside, slightly removed, slightly detached. Not enough to notice immediately, but enough to change how everything feels. Conversations lose their spontaneity. Reactions feel slightly delayed. Even your own thoughts begin to feel filtered, as if they need to pass through a layer of evaluation before they're allowed to exist fully. And that filtering doesn't feel restrictive at first. It feels like control. But control over what? That's where the question becomes more uncomfortable. Because the control isn't protecting you from something external. It's protecting you from something internal. Something that becomes more visible the moment you stop analyzing. And that's exactly why the mind keeps going. Not because it wants to understand people, but because it doesn't want to face what happens when there's nothing left to analyze. And that realization shifts everything. Because now, the thinking is no longer about curiosity or awareness. It becomes avoidance. Not obvious avoidance, not something you can easily point to, but a subtle redirection of attention away from something that feels less defined, less structured, and harder to control. And once that becomes clear, even slightly, the pattern starts to feel different. Not weaker, not gone, but exposed in a way that makes it harder to justify. Because the question is no longer, why do I think about what people think? It becomes, what am I trying not to sit with when I stop? And that question doesn't have the same kind of surface-level complexity. It doesn't invite more analysis. It invites something else entirely. And that's where the problem reveals its deeper layer, not in the thinking itself, but in what the thinking is quietly replacing. And if you stay with that question a little longer, without rushing to answer it, without trying to turn it into something neat or understandable, a different kind of discomfort begins to surface. Not sharp, not overwhelming, but persistent in a way that's harder to escape. Because what starts to become visible isn't another explanation. It's a gap, a space that usually gets filled before you even notice it exists. The moment you stop analyzing how you were seen, there's nothing immediate to replace it. No clear thought, no direction, no structure. Just a kind of quiet that feels unfamiliar, almost unfinished. And that's the part the mind avoids, not because it's dangerous, but because it lacks definition. Most people assume they think about others because they are too focused on external validation. But what's often overlooked is that this constant thinking also serves as a form of internal occupation. It gives your attention somewhere to go, something to process, something that feels productive even when it isn't resolving anything. Without it, you're left with something far less structured. You're left with yourself, without interpretation. And that experience is more difficult than it sounds, because without the layer of analysis, there's no immediate way to measure how you're doing, no subtle indicators telling you whether you're acceptable, interesting, appropriate, or aligned. There's just a direct experience of being, without commentary. And for a mind that has become used to monitoring, that absence of feedback feels like a loss of orientation. So it returns to what it knows. It picks up the last interaction, the last expression, the last moment that felt slightly unclear, and begins working through it again. Not because it expects a new answer, but because the act of thinking itself restores a sense of structure. It creates the feeling that something is being handled, even if nothing is actually being resolved. And this is where the problem becomes more difficult to notice. Because the thinking doesn't feel like avoidance. It feels like engagement. It feels like you're trying to understand, trying to improve, trying to be more aware. But underneath that, there's a quiet substitution happening. Instead of sitting with something undefined, you move into something familiar. And over time, that movement becomes automatic. You don't notice the shift from presence to analysis. You don't feel the moment where attention leaves what is happening and enters what might have happened or what could have been perceived differently. It all blends together into a continuous experience that feels normal. But the cost of that normality is subtle. You lose access to something that doesn't make noise when it disappears. A kind of internal stillness that isn't based on certainty, but on not needing it. A way of existing that doesn't require constant reference points to feel stable. And without that, stability becomes something you try to build externally, piece by piece, through observation and interpretation. But that structure never holds, because every new interaction introduces new variables, new uncertainties, new possibilities that need to be accounted for. So the mind keeps working, not toward an end, but in a loop that sustains itself. And the longer it runs, the more it begins to feel like a necessary part of how you function. That's where the deeper conflict sits. Not in the fear of being judged, but in the inability to stop checking without feeling slightly disoriented. Because by now, the checking isn't just about people. It's about maintaining a sense of position, a sense of clarity about where you stand in relation to everything around you. And when that position depends on something external, even slightly, it can never fully settle. There's always another interaction, another expression, another moment that could mean something different than you initially thought. And that possibility keeps the system active, not in a chaotic way, but in a controlled, continuous way that feels almost necessary. But underneath that control, there's a quiet instability. Not obvious, not disruptive, but present enough to keep the process going. Because if everything felt stable on its own, there would be no need to keep checking. There would be no reason to revisit, to reanalyze, to search for something that keeps shifting. And this is where the pattern reveals its most uncomfortable layer. It's not that you're dependent on what people think. It's that you've learned to use their perceived thoughts as a way to avoid facing a version of yourself that doesn't come with immediate clarity, a version that isn't defined by reaction, that isn't shaped by feedback, that doesn't provide quick answers about how you're doing. And that version feels unfamiliar. Not because it's wrong, but because it hasn't been given space to exist without interruption. So the mind returns to what it knows. It keeps analyzing, keeps observing, keeps constructing a sense of understanding that feels safer than the absence of it. And over time, that process becomes so consistent that it no longer feels like a choice. It feels like the only way to stay oriented. But that orientation is fragile because it depends on something that is constantly changing, something that can never provide a fixed reference point. And as long as that dependency remains, the thinking will continue. Not because it needs to, but because it hasn't learned how to stop without losing its sense of direction. And that's the real problem. Not the thoughts themselves, not the people, not even the uncertainty, but the fact that without this process, there is a part of you that doesn't quite know how to exist without checking. And that realization doesn't offer comfort. It doesn't provide an immediate way out, but it does something more important. It exposes the mechanism clearly enough that it can no longer hide behind the idea of just thinking too much. Because this isn't random, it's precise, it's structured. It's been quietly shaping how you relate to yourself for a long time. And once you see it that way, the question changes again. It's no longer about stopping the thoughts by force. It becomes about understanding what happens when you don't follow them. Because that's where the shift begins, not in the thinking, but in what you allow to remain when the thinking doesn't take over. And that's exactly where the possibility of something different starts to appear, not as a sudden change, but as a subtle opening that hasn't been explored yet. If you look closely, the solution doesn't begin where most people expect it to. It doesn't begin by trying to stop the thinking or by convincing yourself that people's opinions don't matter. That approach feels logical, but it fails for a simple reason. The thinking was never sustained by logic in the first place. It was sustained by a function. It had a role. And removing it without understanding that role only creates a different kind of tension. So the shift doesn't start by removing the habit. It starts by changing your position in relation to it. Because right now, the moment a thought appears, what did they think of me? Your mind treats it as something that needs to be followed, not questioned, not examined, just continued. It becomes a thread you automatically pick up. And once you pick it up, the process unfolds on its own. But what most people don't notice is that the moment before you follow it is still available. That small space, almost invisible, where the thought appears but hasn't been engaged yet. That's where the shift begins. Not by stopping the thought, but by not immediately entering it. At first, this feels unnatural, almost incomplete. Because you're used to finishing the loop, to taking the thought somewhere, to extracting meaning from it. So when you don't follow it, there's a brief sense of interruption, like leaving a sentence unfinished. But that discomfort is important, because it reveals something that usually stays hidden. The thinking continues, not because it must, but because it's been given continuation automatically. And once you see that, even slightly, something begins to loosen. Not the thoughts themselves, they will still appear, but the assumption that you have to go with them begins to weaken. And that changes the entire dynamic, because now the process is no longer fully automatic. You begin to notice the pattern instead of being inside it. And that distinction matters more than it seems. Because when you're inside it, Every thought feels relevant, every detail feels worth analyzing, every uncertainty feels like something that needs resolution. But when you start to observe it, even for a few seconds, something becomes clear that wasn't visible before. The thoughts don't actually move toward a conclusion. They circle, they refine, they repeat with slight variations, but they don't resolve. And seeing that directly, not as an idea, but as an experience, changes how much authority they hold. Because the mind is very convincing when you're engaged in it. It presents each thought as if it's leading somewhere meaningful. But when you step back, even briefly, the structure becomes obvious. It's not moving forward, it's maintaining itself. And once that becomes visible, the urgency begins to fade. Not completely, not immediately, but enough to create space. And that space is where something else can start to emerge. Not a new belief, not a replacement thought, but a different way of relating to what's happening internally. A way that doesn't require constant engagement to feel stable. But here's where it becomes more subtle, because simply observing the thoughts is not enough if it becomes another form of control. If you turn observation into a technique, something you do to stop the thinking, then the mind just adapts. It turns that into another process, another way of managing itself. So the shift isn't about controlling the thoughts from a distance. It's about allowing them to exist without giving them a direction, letting them appear without needing to continue them, letting them fade without needing to resolve them. And that sounds simple, but it goes against something deeper. Because part of you still believes that if you don't analyze, you'll miss something. That something important will go unnoticed, that a mistake will remain uncorrected, that you'll lose the ability to adjust. But that belief only holds as long as you've never tested the alternative. Because what most people don't realize is, the ability to respond in the moment doesn't come from analysis after the fact. It comes from being fully present during the moment itself. And presence doesn't require monitoring. In fact, monitoring interrupts it. So when you stop following the thoughts, even briefly, you're not losing awareness. You're returning to a different kind of awareness. One that doesn't split your attention between experiencing and evaluating. And that shift feels unfamiliar at first. Not because it's wrong, but because it removes something you've relied on for a long time. It removes the constant reference point that told you where you stood, even if it was never accurate. And without that reference, there's a brief period where things feel less defined, less certain, but also less heavy. Because you're no longer carrying every interaction forward. You're no longer trying to extract a final answer from something that doesn't have one. You're simply allowing the moment to end when it ends. And that's where a different kind of stability begins to form. Not based on external feedback, not built through constant checking, but emerging quietly from not interfering with your own experience. And it doesn't arrive all at once. It shows up in small shifts, moments where you notice a thought and don't follow it. Moments where something feels unresolved, but you don't rush to resolve it. Moments where the need to check softens, even slightly. And those moments don't feel significant at first. But they accumulate, and over time, they begin to change how your mind operates. Not by force, but by reducing the need for constant engagement. And that's where the process starts to move in a different direction. Not by removing thoughts, but by removing the habit of continuing them. And as that habit weakens, something else becomes possible. Not a sudden silence, not a complete absence of thinking, but a different relationship with it. One where thoughts can exist without controlling your attention. And that's the point where the shift becomes real. Because now, you're no longer trying to stop thinking about what people think. You're no longer depending on those thoughts to define where you stand. You're simply not building on them, and that changes everything in a way that isn't dramatic, but is unmistakable once it begins, because what follows from that isn't just less thinking, it's something deeper, a form of independence that doesn't come from rejecting others, but from no longer needing their perceived thoughts to stabilize yourself. And that's where this begins to open into something that doesn't rely on control at all, but something much quieter, something that doesn't need to prove itself to feel real, which is exactly where the final shift begins to take shape. And when that shift starts to take shape, even in a small way, it doesn't feel like a breakthrough. It feels almost underwhelming. There's no clear moment where everything changes, no sharp contrast between before and after. Instead, something more subtle begins to happen. The thoughts still appear. The same patterns still try to form, but they don't pull you in with the same force. There's a slight delay, a small distance that wasn't there before, and in that distance, something new begins to exist. Not clarity in the usual sense, not answers, not certainty, but a kind of steadiness that doesn't depend on resolving anything. And that steadiness is easy to overlook because it doesn't demand attention. It doesn't feel urgent. It doesn't try to prove itself. It simply remains quietly in the background, becoming more noticeable only when the noise begins to settle. This is where the idea of emotional independence becomes less abstract. Not as a belief, not as a goal, but as a direct experience. It's the ability to exist without needing to constantly reference how you might be perceived. Not because you've decided that people's opinions don't matter, but because your sense of yourself is no longer built on tracking them. And that difference is important, because rejecting other people's opinions is still a reaction to them. It's still a form of dependence, just inverted. But this isn't about rejection. It's about disengagement from the process that made those opinions feel necessary in the first place, and that process doesn't disappear overnight. There will still be moments where the mind returns to old patterns, where a small interaction pulls your attention back into analysis, where you catch yourself replaying something without realizing it. But the difference is that now, those moments don't define the entire experience. They become interruptions, not the default. And once something becomes an interruption instead of a baseline, it loses its authority. You don't need to fight it. You don't need to correct it. You simply notice that it's happening. And in that noticing, the momentum begins to weaken. Not immediately, not completely, but enough to change the direction. Over time, this creates a different rhythm. Instead of constantly moving outward, trying to interpret, trying to align, trying to confirm, your attention begins to settle inward. Not in a reflective, analytical way, but in a direct, unfiltered way. You start experiencing moments without immediately translating them into meaning. Conversations happen without needing to be evaluated afterward. Reactions occur without needing to be adjusted in real time. And that shift feels unfamiliar at first. Not because it's uncomfortable, but because it lacks the constant activity you've become used to. There's less to do, less to process, less to manage. And for a mind that has been operating in a continuous loop, that absence can feel strange, almost like something is missing. But nothing is missing. Something has simply stopped. And in that absence, a different kind of presence becomes possible. One that doesn't rely on control. One that doesn't need constant feedback to feel stable. One that doesn't measure itself through external reflections. This is where the idea of being yourself begins to change. It's no longer something you try to achieve, something you adjust toward, something you check for consistency. It becomes something that exists on its own, without needing to be confirmed. Not perfectly, not permanently, but enough to no longer feel dependent on how it's received. And that doesn't mean you stop caring about people. It means your awareness of them is no longer tied to your sense of self. You can notice reactions without absorbing them. You can hear opinions without needing to position yourself around them. You can exist in the same space as others without constantly recalibrating who you are. And that is a very different way of moving through the world. Not louder, not more confident in the usual sense, but quieter in a way that doesn't need to defend itself. And that quiet doesn't come from effort. It comes from not interfering, from allowing your experience to be what it is, without layering it with interpretation, without turning every moment into something that needs to be understood or corrected. And the more that becomes natural, the less the original question holds weight. Because the question, "What do they think of me?" begins to lose its relevance, not because you've answered it, but because you've stopped needing it to define anything. And that is where the loop finally begins to break. Not all at once, not completely, but enough to create a different direction. One where your attention is no longer pulled outward by default. One where your sense of self is no longer dependent on something that constantly changes. And that direction doesn't require effort to maintain. It only requires that you continue to notice when the old pattern tries to return and allow it to pass without building on it. That's all. No force, no correction. Just a quiet refusal to continue something that no longer serves a purpose. And if you stay with that, if you allow that small shift to deepen without rushing it, something unexpected begins to happen. You don't become someone new. You stop trying to locate yourself through other people. And in that absence, you begin to feel something that wasn't available before. Not certainty, not validation, but something much simpler. Something that doesn't need to be confirmed. And that's where this doesn't end. It opens. Not into a conclusion, but into a different way of experiencing yourself that doesn't depend on constant interpretation. If this felt familiar in a way you couldn't quite explain, don't rush past it. Stay with it a little longer. There's more to see in this. More than what fits into a single moment of understanding. And if you're willing to keep exploring that space without trying to control it, without trying to define it too quickly, you'll start noticing changes that don't need to announce themselves to be real. There's more waiting for you in that direction.